There are names that history has almost erased, faces blurred by centuries of silence, and deeds so hideous that chroniclers hesitated to record them. Yet sometimes, in forgotten manuscripts, in the margins of dusty parchments, or in the whispered tales of peasants, the truth resurfaces, unearthing the horror of a time when cruelty itself wore the crown. I shall tell you the story of one such prince, a man born not to rule wisely, but to indulge his insatiable hunger for death and fear. He was young, handsome in a pale and unsettling way, and he bore the title of heir with pride. His father was a ruler of a turbulent realm, a kingdom torn between foreign wars and domestic conspiracies. In such an atmosphere of paranoia, blood became the currency of power. And for this prince, blood was also a form of entertainment. From his earliest years, he had been fascinated not with the gallantry of knights or the wisdom of counselors, but with the spectacle of punishment. It is said that when he was a boy of barely 10, he would sneak into the courtyard of the fortress where executions were carried out. Hidden behind the iron bars of a balcony, he would watch as men and women accused of treason or theft were led to the block. While others averted their eyes, the boy's gaze never wavered. He watched the executioner's blade descend. He studied the faces of the condemned in their last breath, and when the heads rolled upon the straw, his lips curled into a smile. The courtiers whispered among themselves. Some said the boy was cursed, marked at birth by a dark star. Others said it was the blood of his ancestors, for his grandfather too had been a tyrant, a man who ordered entire villages burned for a single insult. Yet there were also those who believed the prince was merely reflecting the times, an age in which cruelty was a spectacle enjoyed by nobles and peasants alike. But this prince went further than all of them. By the time he reached 15 years of age, the prince had begun to demand a place of honor during executions. He no longer wished to watch from afar. Instead, he stood at the edge of the scaffold, clothed in velvet and gold, his pale hands resting on the pommel of his ceremonial sword. When the axe fell and the head was severed, he would step forward, demanding that the executioner hand him the trophy. At first, the soldiers hesitated, for the act seemed unholy. But who could deny the heir to the throne? And so the grisly game began. The prince would take the freshly severed head in his hands, as though it were a chalice. He would turn it to study the expression, twisted in terror, frozen forever in the final scream. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he mocked the dead, speaking to them as if they could still hear him. And when his amusement was spent, he tossed the head aside like a discarded toy and ordered another execution to begin. The people of the city soon grew accustomed to the sight. They no longer gasped when the prince lifted a head by its hair. Instead, they lowered their eyes and prayed. Mothers pressed their children to their skirts, warning them never to speak ill of the royal family. For the punishment was not only death, it was degradation in the hands of a merciless youth who saw in their fathers and brothers nothing but objects for his macabre games. But what the crowd did not know, and what even the prince's father suspected too late, was that these executions were not merely punishments for crimes. Behind the spectacle of justice lay something darker. A conspiracy was unfolding within the walls of the palace, and the prince, in his perverse hunger, had become both its mask and its weapon. For you see, the kingdom was not stable. Factions vied for influence. The nobles plotted in candlelit halls, priests whispered in their cloisters, and foreign ambassadors sowed discord with gold and promises. Treason was everywhere, or at least, that is what the prince's father was told by his advisors. Lists of names were drawn up, accusations were made, and the prisons overflowed. And so the executions multiplied. Every week more heads fell. The scaffold was never dry of blood. The city square, once a place of markets and festivals, became a theater of death. And the prince was always there, smiling, playing, as if fate itself had chosen him to preside over this crimson carnival. Some said he had visions, that at night he dreamed of the severed heads rising from the earth, whispering secrets in the darkness. Others believed he was simply drunk on the fear of the people, for nothing binds a crown tighter than terror. But the truth, as it would later emerge, was far worse. Among those executed were not only thieves and traitors, but loyal servants of the crown. Men who had stood by the king for decades, generals who had won wars, priests who had counseled mercy. Their deaths were not the result of crime, but of accusation, and the accusations came from within the court itself. Someone was feeding the king false names, weaving a web of paranoia, and using the prince as the tool of destruction. And the boy did not question. He did not ask whether the condemned were guilty. He did not seek truth. He only sought their heads. That was the beginning. The chronicles of this time, though fragmented, agree on one detail. The court grew silent in his presence. Ministers trembled when they entered the throne hall. Nobles bowed lower than necessary, speaking only in whispers. Even the king, who once ruled with iron command, began to falter when his son appeared at his side. For the youth had become more than a prince. He was a shadow looming over all, a reminder that power could be wielded without reason, and that the scaffold was only a command away. And yet, for all his cruelty, the prince was still but a piece in a larger game. He thought himself master, but in truth he was a puppet, a blade guided by unseen hands. Who those hands belonged to, and what their true purpose was, would only be revealed when the kingdom itself began to crack under the weight of blood and fear. For now, remember this: a boy who grew to love the heads of the executed was not born in isolation. He was the fruit of a court poisoned by lies, conspiracies, and ambition. And though the people shivered at his laughter, the real horror lay not in the games of the prince, but in the truth that no one dared stop him. I knew the square long before I knew the truth. I knew the creak of the scaffold, the rasp of the rope when it slid over the beam, the sour breath of the crowd that gathered like a tide around the block. I knew the boy, too, though he was already a prince. He came in silks that caught the morning sun, and when the axe fell he leaned forward with the same eager calm with which a naturalist might study a rare insect. He lifted the head by the hair, turned the face toward himself, and spoke as though to a guest who had arrived late to supper. No one laughed. No one gasped. They had learned that sound traveled, and that the prince liked to follow sounds. I believed then, as many did, that we were watching the inevitable cruelty of a season. Kings grow suspicious, courts grow thorned, and a prince, impatient for a throne, finds his sport in the meantime. Yet the number of executions was not the only thing that troubled me. It was their music. Names came in clusters, like notes arranged to form a hidden melody. A lord of the northern mills was followed by the captain of a river gate, and then by the abbess whose convent oversaw the granaries. They were not relatives by blood, nor allies by oath, yet something bound them in invisible twine. Crime that season had learned to wear a pattern. Patterns are prayer to anyone who has sat long hours in a scriptorium. I had, and so I began to copy them. I kept a separate ledger, a poor monk's book bound in rough hide and stitched with twine, and I filled it with 3 columns: the name, the charge, and the estate seized by the crown upon the condemned's death. It was a dry exercise at first, an act of self-preservation, since the 4th column, left blank, would have been my own name if I spoke too loudly. But dry ink darkens. After a month, the pattern hardened into something that could no longer be mistaken. Estates that fed the city, guard posts that watched the river, priories that tended the poor, all stripped from their stewards and folded into a new pair of hands. The king's seal ratified each transfer, yet the recipients were not the king. 3 names rose like black towers from the parchment. The first was Lord Odric, the chancellor, a quiet man whose voice rarely rose above a whisper and whose seal cut deeper than any shout. The second was Bishop Marcel of St. Severin, who preached mercy in the cathedral and demanded severity in the council chamber. The third was Lady Isabeau, mistress of the wardrobe, who dressed the queen, dismissed the queen's servants, and arranged the queen's meetings, which is to say, arranged the queen's solitude. They were called the Triune not by those who knew enough to fear them and not enough to flee. Together they fed the king names, and they fed the prince heads, and they fed themselves the bones of the kingdom. It would be comforting to believe that the prince was entirely their creature, a puppet whose strings drank oil from the hands that pulled them. That would spare us the vision of a soul choosing, of eyes opening each morning with intention. But I cannot grant him that innocence. The knot did not create his hunger. They salted it, seasoned it, and set before him a banquet. The palace physician brewed him cordial cups at night, thick as old wine and perfumed with cinnamon to mask the crushed poppy beneath. The prince slept little and woke with a sharpened gaze, his breath sweet, his pulse impatient. The physician later called it a restorative. I call it a leash dipped in honey. And so the games around the scaffold became more intricate. He commanded the executioner to keep the blade clean and the stroke sure, for he did not like to see a face disfigured by clumsy work. He had a board brought from the palace, lacquered and checkered, and on feast days he arranged the heads upon it, setting knights against bishops, pawns against queens, and always the king endangered. The crowd saw a monster and forgot to see the net behind him. The tribune not needed the crowd to look no further than the prince's hands, for those hands were gaudy and unforgettable. And while a city stares at a lantern, men can enter a house by the dark door. A single witness severed the knot for me. He should have been a shadow among many, another pair of arms among the city's hired cruelty. But age had made him talkative and fear had made him precise. He was the old executioner, the last of the guild that prided itself on clean deaths and mute mouths. He found me in the refectory one evening, drawn by the smell of soup or by the smell of safety, and he sat across from me with a tremble that did not belong to hunger. He told me of an afternoon when the prince took a head, cradled it, and called it by a name none of us had heard in years. He called it Mother. There are words that pry open doors you did not know existed. The queen had died when the prince was still a boy, and the court had buried not only her body but her memory. Her chambers were sealed. Her portraits went missing. Her ladies married or retired or joined convents on very far roads. A prince of any realm looks like his parents until he looks like himself, and so we forgot to compare. Yet the old man swore that he had heard the prince whisper the name, and he mimicked the tenderness with which the syllables left the mouth. A tenderness I had never seen on the scaffold. I returned to my ledger, and I found a seam I had not noticed. Alongside the officials who controlled food and gates, another bloodline had been quietly cut to stumps. The queen's kindred, cousins who had stood nearest her at court. The priest who had married her before she crossed the sea to our king. The midwife who had attended the prince's birth. None were executed under the easy banner of treason. Their charges were peculiar, private, tailored as a hangman's coat. Obscenity, sorcery, perjury, heathen rites. Nets of words that do not hold truth, only panic. I sought the midwife's house. I found its stones and I found its absence. The street bent around a vacant place like a river around a sandbar, and the neighbors learned to talk about the weather when anyone asked about that turn in the road. An old mason, drunk on a patience earned through long years of dust, told me that the night the midwife was taken, wagons came before dawn and men with city seals took her door, her shutters, her table, her bed, even the hearthstone. Nothing must remain, they said, and the mason laughed, because only a fool thinks a hearthstone cannot remain. He had taken the hearthstone and set it into the threshold of the Red Tower. The Red Tower held archives on its upper floors and silence on its lower. Silence, however, is a clumsy thing when it is made by men. There were marks in the mortar that told of a wall raised where a door had been, and there was a smell behind it that did not belong to dry stone. It was not rot. It was old milk. I tell you this because lies always leave behind a domestic scent. I pressed my ear to the new wall and heard nothing, which is the loudest message masonry can send. The tribune knot had not only erased the queen's kindred, it had bricked in the room in which something had been recorded, and they had taken the key to the king. I did not possess a hammer, but I possessed a tongue. Words can pick locks when steel cannot. I told a junior clerk that I sought a misplaced grant of pasture to a monastery that had never existed. He brought me to the wrong shelf in the right room. The wrong shelf had its boards planed too smooth. A smooth board draws the finger the way a mirror draws the eye. Behind the board was a pouch. In the pouch, a letter. The seal was broken, and the red wax showed the impression of a lily turned upside down, which is how one shows a flower that has wilted, or a crown that has fallen, or a truth that must be read in reverse. I will not repeat the letter in full, for a letter is a trap for the unwary and a banquet for those who live by scour and rumor. It was plain enough. The queen had come to the capital already ill. The physicians feared she would bear no child. She bore one, and then she bore fever. The physician who now brews sweet night draughts for the prince brewed something stronger then, and Bishop Marcel wrote that it was God's will and the kingdom's need. The letter did not accuse, for cowards avoid the simplicity of a dagger even when they hold one. It merely recorded. It recorded that the midwife had protested. It recorded that her protest ended inside the Red Tower. It recorded, in a final line set apart like a prayer, that the prince was not delivered alive until a second pair of hands arrived. The second pair belonged to Lady Isabeau. You may say that this is smoke, and that I have not yet led you to the fire. You are right. A story can only open doors one by one without drawing the entire garrison. But the corridor is lit now. The prince's games were not only a boy's depravity. They were the theater in which the triune knot staged the murder of memory. Through him they turned suspicion into spectacle, and through spectacle they turned theft into law. And beneath that law, buried and mortared, lay a truth wetter and more personal than any confiscated estate. A queen who died to make room, and a prince whose first lullaby was a council's calculation. The city, in its weariness, believed that nothing could stop the prince because nothing dared. The truth is uglier. No one stopped him because someone needed him to continue. And while he played with heads, the hands that fed him were tying a noose too subtle for rope and too permanent for a knot. In the next part, I will show you where that noose was fixed and who first felt it tighten. The deeper I looked, the more I understood that the prince's cruelty was not an isolated sickness, but a mask worn by the kingdom itself. A mask of madness that concealed the hands of the triune knot and their long harvest of power. Yet as with every mask, the cracks began to show. The first crack was silence where there should have been song. In the winter following the queen's erasure from memory, the Cathedral of St. Severin prepared its Feast of Martyrs, an ancient festival when choirs of boys filled the city with voices that climbed higher than the bells. That year, there were no choirs. The boys had vanished. Some were said to have been sent to rural abbeys for instruction. But the truth whispered by their mothers was darker. They had been summoned to the palace, and not all returned. It was then that the rumors began to knot themselves around the prince like ivy. He was said to wander the crypts at night, holding a lantern and a skull, speaking to it as though it were an old friend. He was said to bathe in blood, to anoint his hair with it, though I knew such talk was exaggeration. Yet exaggeration often grows from a seed of truth, and the truth was that more heads were falling than ever before. Each week, the scaffold groaned under the weight of fresh bodies, and the prince's laughter could be heard above the murmurs of the crowd. But the second crack was louder. It came in the form of a soldier, one of the king's own guard, who stumbled into a tavern near the river and poured out a tale with too much wine and too much grief. He had been commanded to escort a prisoner from the northern provinces, a noblewoman accused of harboring letters of treason. Yet when he delivered her to the Red Tower, she was not imprisoned. She was taken straight to the scaffold, and her head was carried not to the block of oak but into the palace itself, placed in a chest lined with velvet, and borne away by Lady Isabeau. The soldier swore that he had seen her lips move as she bent over the head, whispering a prayer or a command. That chest was not the only one. I began to hear of more, boxes of cedar, of oak, of iron-bound pine, all carried into the palace under the cover of night. Not relics, not treasures, but heads. The prince's trophies, preserved by the knot as though they were relics of saints. By then, the king himself had grown frail, his body eaten away by fever and his mind clouded by whispers. He rarely left his chambers, and when he did, it was only to sit on the throne in silence while the prince spoke in his stead. The boy, who had once been mocked for his strange amusements, now commanded the council with words sharpened by the hands that guided him. Bishop Marcel clothed his decrees in the language of Scripture, Chancellor Odric sealed them in law, and Lady Isabeau enforced them in the queen's abandoned halls. It was no longer a kingdom, it was a puppet stage, and the strings were drenched in blood. But every puppet stage eventually suffers a fire. The spark came from the prisons. One of the scribes charged with recording the names of the condemned began to copy them twice, once in the royal ledger and once in secret. This man, I dare not write his true name, for even now his descendants might pay for it, brought me his hidden parchment one night, his eyes darting like a hunted animal. He laid it upon the table and showed me what I had begun to suspect. The condemned were not random. They were threads cut with purpose. The families erased were those who had once sworn loyalty not to the king, but to the queen. Not only nobles, but servants, clerics, even merchants whose fortunes had risen with her dowry. Piece by piece, every memory of her reign was being excised, every root of her bloodline salted. The knot was not merely feeding the prince's cruelty. They were carving history itself, remaking it so that the queen had never truly lived, and the prince was a creature born not of a mother but of the knot's own design. The scribe was trembling as he spoke, for he knew that knowledge itself was a death sentence. He begged me to take the parchment and burn it, for even he could not bear to keep it. But I did not burn it. I hid it, as I had hidden my other ledger, beneath the stones of the abbey's floor. To this day, I sometimes wonder if those stones remember more than the living. And then came the third crack, the one that split the kingdom wide. A conspiracy against the prince was uncovered. Not a false one invented by the knot, but a true conspiracy born of desperation. A group of nobles, knights, and even priests had gathered in secret, vowing to put an end to the blood carnival. They swore not to depose the king, for his frailty was beyond blame, but to seize the prince and end his reign before it began. They planned to strike during one of his beloved executions, to rush the scaffold, to cut him down with the same steel that had severed so many necks. But the knot was always listening. The plot was betrayed before it could breathe. On the appointed day, the conspirators were dragged to the scaffold themselves, and the prince, with gleeful malice, demanded that their heads be struck one by one, not swiftly, but slowly, with strokes that tested the executioner's patience. He held each head aloft, not to laugh this time, but to whisper into its ear, as though mocking the silence that followed. The crowd did not cheer. They did not gasp. They simply watched, hollow and afraid, for the last hope of resistance had been drowned in blood. Yet in that moment, something shifted in the air. I felt it in my bones as I watched. The people no longer saw a boy with a cruel amusement. They saw a prince whose games had swallowed their entire world. And though their voices were still silent, silence itself can be a rebellion. Fear can rot, and rot, once begun, spreads faster than any flame. The knot believed they had triumphed. They believed the prince's cruelty had extinguished every spark of defiance. But they did not see that the very excess of their theater had planted a seed, not of fear, but of hatred. A hatred that would not remain buried forever. And soon that hatred would be given a name, a face, and a purpose. The prince still played with the heads of the executed, but already unseen hands were preparing a different stage. A stage where heads would roll not at his command, but because of it. And it is that stage which I shall unveil in the final part of this tale. Cruelty devours itself, and the story of the prince who played with the heads of the executed came to its end as slowly and as horribly as it had begun. When his father, the king, died, there was no mourning, no procession of banners, no weeping throngs. The people had already buried their hope long before the coffin was lowered into the crypt of Saint Severin. The prince proclaimed himself sovereign, but he was sovereign of famine, of silence, of ashes. The knot that had raised him began to loosen around him. Odric the chancellor feared the boy's madness would ruin his careful hoarding of estates. Marcel the bishop muttered of demons when the prince laughed at night in the palace halls, and Isabeau hid in the queen's old chambers, whispering to shadows as if she too now believed in ghosts. The city starved. Bread disappeared. Grain lay locked in granaries guarded by soldiers, and the scaffold, once crowded with spectators, now stood nearly deserted. The prince grew furious, for cruelty without an audience is no longer theater. It is only madness. He demanded more executions. He ordered prisoners dragged from their cells. But the silence of the crowd was heavier than any shout. He began to wander at night, clutching one of his preserved heads like a lantern, speaking to it in his mother's name, asking it for counsel, waiting for an answer. When the Knot saw this, they understood he was no longer their tool but their danger. Yet they did nothing, for fear had chained them to their own creation. And then the people themselves moved. One night the palace woke to find the city square empty, the scaffold abandoned. The guards sent to fetch peasants from their homes returned with nothing, for the streets were deserted, the houses hollow. The people had gone into hiding, vanishing into forests, barns, cellars, refusing to play their part in the prince's theater. Enraged, the boy stormed through the corridors of his palace, demanding obedience, only to find council chambers deserted, halls echoing with his own footsteps. The Knot had fled, Odric to his estates, Marcel to his fortress monastery, Isabeau deeper into the sealed chambers of the queen. For the first time he was truly alone, with nothing but the heads he had cherished. But silence is not only contempt, it is preparation. On the third night the people returned, not with chants or banners, but with torches. They surrounded the palace and starved it as they themselves had starved. The guards deserted. The gates cracked open. They found the prince not on his throne but in the queen's chamber, seated before her mirror, his face painted with her powders, his cheeks red with her rouge. Around him he had placed the preserved heads from his cedar chests, arranged like courtiers at a banquet, and he whispered to them, smiling when the mob burst in, lifting one as though to offer a toast. No one agrees on what followed. Some say he was dragged to the scaffold and decapitated by the same axe that had struck down so many. Others claim he was torn apart by the mob, his body scattered so no grave could honor him. Still others whisper that he was bricked alive into the Red Tower, left to mutter to the dark until his voice fell silent. The Knot perished as well. Odric hanged from the gate of his own estate by peasants who had starved on his grain. Marcel burned alive in his monastery fortress. Isabeau found in the queen's bedchamber, her throat cut. By her own hand or another's, none could say. What became of the heads no one knows. Some believe they were buried in consecrated earth. Others that they still lie beneath the stones of the palace. But I believe stone remembers. And so the tale ends, of a prince who believed himself master but was only ever a pawn, of a court that fed cruelty until it became uncontrollable, of a people who endured until silence turned into revolt. His laughter is gone, but if in some empty hall you hear a voice speaking softly where no one stands, perhaps it is his, the boy who played with the heads of the executed, waiting still for them to answer.